Hello. One of the interesting things I think about presenting this late is seeing if other people have used any of the material you intended to use. So unfortunately David from Salford used my joke, so I don't have a joke anymore. So it's 30 minutes without a joke, I'm afraid. The other interesting thing is that Stephen from Dell kind of stole a bit of my thunder, because the question I was going to ask right at the beginning was, has everyone in the room heard of IBM? And I think the answer is probably yes. And how many people in the room knew IBM did security? Oh, it's not too bad. So if I could ask you to remember one thing, and my whole day will have been worthwhile, if you can remember IBM do security, my boss will be really happy. And he'll probably sign my expenses, which will be great. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the threat landscape out in the real world. The IBM X-Force are a large, possibly the largest threat research team in the world. They look into vulnerabilities and issues with software, predominantly the kind of software that businesses use. So we don't tend to delve into sort of home type software. We look at vulnerabilities in Windows and Office and all of those kind of things that everybody's got on their laptops. And we publish a report every year. In fact, every 6 months we publish a report. The new half-year report is out in about 3 weeks' time. And it goes into detail about what we've seen and what we've seen on the internet, what the threats we've seen, what the attacks we've seen. And we augment that information. IBM are a pretty large managed service organisation, so we managed thousands of devices and millions of events. And so the data that you're going to see is very much based on both the research that we've done and what we've seen in the world. And that says what I've just said. So what the X-Force's mission really is to research vulnerabilities, they produce the decodes for our intrusion prevention systems. They produce lots of advisories. If you're looking for a place for information about the kind of threats that are out, then xforce.iss.net as a website will tell you about just about every vulnerability out in the world with its CVE number. Last year was an interesting year from the point of view of security breaches, so much so that the X-Force coined the phrase that it was the year of the security breach. And I think the difference with the breaches that we saw last year is that they were in companies that we'd heard of. And so everyone's heard of, everyone had heard of Sony. Everybody heard about when Sony got hacked. It made big news. And I guess everyone was aware that companies like that have proper IT security departments. And I think we probably don't believe that they got breached because they didn't spend any money on security. And so that makes a really interesting subject. So it comes out that companies who take security seriously are still at risk, the same as everybody else. Even more so when RSA got attacked. RSA are a security company, it's what they're for. And to them be attacked is very damaging. The damage to their reputation was pretty big. But again, it shows you that they as a company took security seriously. You can still be attacked. What this graph represents, and all the slides are available, if you want the slides you can go and get them, is an analysis of some of the major breaches that we saw last year. And the size of the circle largely represents an assessment of how financially damaging that breach was. So some of the big ones were pretty scary. Where we know what the attack was, it's in there as well. Now the interesting thing about that is security is a strange place really, because we don't share information as well as we might do. In the airline industry, if there's an accident involving a plane, everybody gets to know what caused the accident and everybody talks about it. The information is shared. In the IT security industry, if a company gets breached, the last thing they want to do is tell anybody. And so it presents us with a difficult problem, is how well are we sharing the information and how well do people understand what's going on? And I think that's one of the things that we as an industry will have to look at is greater cooperation. And there are a lot of initiatives, government initiatives, university initiatives, where cooperation is something that people are looking. So what were the key findings from the 2011 report? It's about 260 odd pages. I'm going to summarise it quite dramatically. It's free to download. You can just go and get it and help yourself and have a read. It is relatively interesting. I won't say relative to what, but there's a lot of useful information in it. So what did we see that was new? We saw new attack activity. So the biggest type of attack that we've seen over the years, the last few years, is SQL injection. Are people aware of what I mean by SQL injection type attacks? So if you're hosting a web application that backs into a database, there are ways of manipulating the information to give away more than you want them to. So it could be that people will take a password, it will be that people can download your client list, all sorts of information like that. SQL injection is something that's the premier attack method. The attack method of choice, I suspect, is perhaps the way we ought to look at it. It's changed a little over the last few years. It's changed, unfortunately, in a bad way, and a lot of the attacks now are scripted. They don't require any underlying knowledge of the database structure, so people are able to attack. And so SQL injection is something that we see a lot of problems with. The reason, I guess, that we see a lot of it is the increase in web applications. More and more and more organisations, for business reasons, feel the need to offer services to their customers on the web. And more of those applications are bespoke or written specifically. So it makes it quite hard to put in the right kind of checks. The answer to the problem? Good programming. The answer, I guess, to lots of problems around any kind of application. Be rigorous in your programming, be rigorous in your testing. The more you can do that, the better they are. The other kind of attacks we've seen, well, the interesting thing with the kind of attacks we've seen is that some of them you might think are a bit old hat. So SSH brute forcing is fundamentally trying to guess someone's password. And partly this is due to the fact that there are more and more servers out there on the internet for people to attack. And a lot of it is that some of the servers now perhaps belong to individuals. People feel that they can put their own server up on the network. The increase in very fast broadband has completely changed the landscape in the way that people interact. So we've seen a lot of SSH brute forcing. You can imagine that that is a very scripted process. I, as an individual, don't have to sit there and guess your password. I'll just write a script and run through a dictionary. I actually watched a very interesting presentation, mainly as part of my CISSP that I needed to get some credits. So I watched a presentation about passwords. And the interesting thing that the guy was saying in this is, it doesn't matter how complex your password is. The thing that mostly affects our security is length. And if your password is less than 15 characters, then it's not as secure as it could be. If you get a chance, it's on the SANS website. It's a fantastic presentation. Go and have a little look at it. It's very interesting. He actually goes through the maths about how it works as well, which I won't attempt to do here. The other thing that we've seen a lot of is kind of a return to phishing as an attack. So spam and phishing went down a lot in 2010. They predominantly went down because a lot of the big organisations who were doing the spam got taken out. So they were caught, they were shut down. We've seen a bit of an increase in that again this year. We've particularly seen an increase in things like spear phishing. Are people familiar with the term? So instead of spam that's generically, I could send all of you a spam saying, look at this, it's fantastic. Spear phishing is a little bit cleverer. What it involves is me going and looking at your LinkedIn page and pulling some information, or your Facebook page, or understanding a little bit about you as an individual online and targeting my spam to you. So I might use your first name, I might reference the football team you support, I might make some connection with a bit of business we may have done in the past. And it's all aimed at making that email more plausible, making you more likely to click on that link. And that's increased for two reasons, really. One is the standard reason is to infect your machine. So there is a lot of interest in getting you to click to download something that's a Trojan or a backdoor to get your laptop or your computer to be part of a botnet. But the other thing that we've seen, which is interesting, is what's called click fraud, where people get paid for directing you to a website. So they might get a penny or a cent for every click that they get that links through. And if they can fraudulently get you to click to that website when you think you're going somewhere else, there's money in it for them. And as ever with crime, when there's money in it, it's an incentive. There are lots of graphs. I'm not going to talk about them in any great detail. They're mainly there for the handouts, to be honest with you. But you can see the increase in some of the things that we've just talked about. Phishing is an interesting one because I think people perhaps felt a little bit as if it was beaten. And the interesting thing with a lot of security things on the internet is they can be a bit cyclical. So we can think we've won and we haven't. The other thing I think that it's useful to talk about, because it's been interesting listening to some of the presentations we've had today, there has been progress. Some things have got better. I hate to sort of stand here. I think security is an industry which sometimes can be a bit laden with doom and gloom, and we can give out lots of bad news and tell people how terrible it is. But things get better, and we do make improvements in lots of things. And there are a few that I think that I'd like to look at. So the first one really is around exploits. There were fewer exploits last year than we'd seen in previous years. The interesting thing, this graph is a way of attempting to show, I saw an earlier graph actually where someone did something similar. So what we have in this here is an axis that says how easy was it to exploit this vulnerability. And this is what's the reward for exploiting the vulnerability. So as you can imagine, down here, in the really hard to exploit and there's no money in it, nobody really puts any effort. Because why would you? What's the point? I guess people might do it for kudos, but other than that, they don't. Of the 34 advisories that the X-Force released last year, 16 were in the easy to exploit, and you made a lot out of it. And those are the areas I think that we need to be worried about. So there were lots of things to do with email. There were lots of drive-by downloads, which we've already mentioned. So there sometimes is a perception that the good guys are on the inside and the bad guys are on the outside. And you put your firewall and your IPS and all those other devices that IBM and Dell and other people try to sell you. And that provides you this hard outer shell. And it's always the bad guys trying to come in. Unfortunately, it's not really true. A lot of the threats to your business are your users going out and browsing and things that come out through the browsing. And so there's a lot of worries around insecure browsers and people clicking on things. As we've mentioned earlier, when you see that box that comes up and says, there's a Java download available, do you want to download it? What do we do? What do? I probably click yes straight away, like most people do. So if I was writing a script that exploited something and needed your authority to do it, I'd put a pop-up box that said, there is a Java update, do you want to download it? And you'll say yes, and I'll download whatever it is that I wanted to download. And education of users, I think, is a massive issue. It's an issue for all organisations. We talked a lot about it for compliance, and there were lots of discussions about how you have to do awareness training for compliance. But you also want to make your users aware and savvy because it's the right thing to do for your business. So it's important that your users understand the kind of things they should and shouldn't do. I think, unfortunately, one of the consequences of the changes in social media is people's expectations of what they're going to get back from their interaction with the internet have changed significantly. The interesting thing about the public disclosures last year of exploits is that they were down. Now, I guess if you're looking at that from a lawyer's point of view, you could take the information and say, does that mean there were lots of non-public disclosures? I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. But we certainly saw less public disclosures of vulnerabilities. And the interesting thing as well, I think that there's a useful sort of stat there that the percentage of vulnerabilities with an exploit is down a lot on the previous few years. It'd been pretty steady at about 15% for the last 4 years. And last year it was down. There were only 11% of vulnerabilities had an exploit. Now there's lots of ways of looking at that, statistics being what they are. You can always use statistics to justify anything you want. One of the things could be that the vulnerabilities that already have exploits are pretty much paying the bills, so people don't need to create new ones.
The polymorphic nature of them, the way the threats change.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's very interesting that web application vulnerabilities, which have been the big bulk of vulnerabilities, they've pretty much been half for quite a long time, actually went down to only 41%. So that's an interesting number. The number of vulnerabilities went down 41%, but the number of attacks using SQL injection went up. So that tells me that people are still using the old vulnerabilities and the old exploits and are still being successful. So there's work to be done. The other thing that's interesting, and it's the problem that's the perennial problem, I go talk to organisations a lot about security, and patching is generally the one that makes people start to cry, because both logistically and technically it's such a hard thing to do. The interesting thing is that generally it got better last year. So of all the vulnerabilities that were out, only 36% remained unpatched. Now I say only 36%, I know that's kind of a big number, but it's a lot better than it's been in previous years. So there's been an improvement. And of the ones that were patched, 91% of the patched vulnerabilities had a patch the same day, which is pretty impressive because it begins to look as if the big vendors are stepping up and starting to say, we're going to own this problem, we're going to start producing patches. Now the problem comes not in whether the patch was available, but whether the patch was applied. And that's the question that's very difficult to answer. So I suspect in most organisations, the time between a patch being available and a patch being applied is the most significant gap there is. And certainly when I go out and talk to people, I talk to people about intrusion prevention systems a lot. I've been doing it for a long time. Probably most people have heard my presentation now. And the interesting timeline with vulnerabilities is the day you write the software, the vulnerability's there. It's a bug. Or it's a mistake, perhaps, if we're being fairer, but there's something wrong. At some point, the vulnerability is discovered. At some point, there is an exploit. And at some point, there is a patch. Now, ideally, if this is the exploit, then the patch is here. And you've applied the patch before the exploit's available. In practice, that can be difficult, and certainly that's the kind of area we talk to you about. The last thing that I want to just touch on a little bit in this session is the way the threat landscape has changed, and it's changed a lot because of a lot of the things that we've already talked about today. So cloud computing, people talk about. IBM in particular, a real big deal about cloud. It will be on just about every IBM website you ever go to. So is security any different in the cloud? Are the challenges of security any different? And I think that for the most part they aren't. I think that the security that you need in the cloud is the same. But the basic security you need on your data or on your information is still the same. You still need the same confidentiality, integrity, availability. You've got exactly the same problems. The challenge actually becomes a different one. It becomes a bit more of a relationship challenge. So you have to manage your cloud supplier. You have to set SLAs and expectations. And so what we're seeing is this interesting trend where companies maybe outsource a lot of IT, but you may find that the time you're going to spend is now on managing that outsource and managing the relationships. And that's an interesting change in the dynamic of a way of a lot of organisations. There is value in cloud, undoubtedly, but it will change the way you think about IT. The other big change is consumerisation, is mobile. So mobile devices have fundamentally changed the way we do business. I carry an iPhone, I've had Blackberries, I access my email through a variety of different systems. I don't have an office, I don't have a desk, I don't have anywhere to call my own, really. It's quite sad. I can work from anywhere. But it does change the problems that's faced. And one of the interesting things is that the amount of exploits against mobiles has gone up. There's no real surprise there. There's more of them out there, and People think they're doing the right thing, but they're not. The interesting challenge will be how the introduction of things like iCloud, which bring together both mobile and cloud, start to impact on vulnerabilities and exploits. Suddenly your data isn't where you think it is. In fact, where is it? That's the first question you maybe need to ask. Where is my data if it's in the cloud? So there's a very interesting set of problems around bring your own devices, and we've certainly seen that mobile apps are being hacked more increasingly. The other thing that's interesting, we're seeing more exploits for Macs. There's been a long thought that Macs are unhackable. That self-evidently isn't true. It's a Unix system underneath, it's hackable. I think perhaps historically there have been less attacks because there were less of them. But the Mac now is a much more consumerized device. So I have friends who've gone out and bought Macs to use as their home computer who aren't graphic designers or hackers. And 10 years ago, that would never have been the case. People didn't have Macs unless they were serious users of a Mac. And so there's more out of them. So actually out there now, there are Mac viruses, there are Mac hacks, there are tools to allow you to attack a Mac. Attack a Mac, that's quite a good saying. I've never even thought of that. So that's going to change things, to change the way people look at it. It also big problems, I think, for your IT organisation, because you've got your AV, and your AV is for Windows because your users use Windows, but we're now going to let this guy use a Mac because he's paid for it himself. And you're kind of in this strange problem. How do you control these devices? How do you control your endpoints? The other problem, I think, which is interesting, is that the perimeter for the traditional company is dissolving. Where is it anymore? It's very hard to say. When I work from home, is the perimeter of IBM my living room? To a certain extent it is. And it changes the way you need to think about the problem. So endpoints become a completely different problem. We have all the issues of encryption. We have all the issues of security in and around the endpoint. And there are lots of... You can tell how much of an issue it is by the number of vendors pushing endpoint solutions. That's generally a good sign of how significant the market is considered. If there are a lot of vendors, it's generally going to be a big market. So, finally, the other thing, the kind of last thing that I'd like to mention a little bit, and it's not to end on a worrying note, but it poses some interesting questions. One thing we saw last year that we've not really seen before is attacks on certificate authorities. And there were 1 or 2 breaches in certificate authorities. Now that, I think, is a worrying trend. Having given lots of good news, I'd say that's something to be worried about, because that attacks the basic integrity of the trust relationship in the internet. And so that's something to be very aware of, to watch that. If you cannot trust the digital signature, or you cannot trust that something is what it says it is, that starts to attack some of the basic foundations. There's lots more detail on that in the X-Force report. Again, I'd recommend that you have a look at that. This page gives you lots of places you can go for our information. All of the stuff the X-Force produces is non-proprietary in the sense of it's not just for IBM. It's freely available. The information is yours to go and look at. The graphics that I've used in this presentation are available for you to download. So if you want to download the graphics and use them in your own presentations for clients, then you can go do that. If you want to download the report and give it to clients to scare them, or if you want to look at it yourself and give yourself some sleepless nights, then by all means do. Remember the good news bit in the middle though. Thank you very much.